Hey guys, this is the Konark Sun Temple in India, and I'm going to show you a sculpture that flies in the face of mainstream history. Historians claim that Africa had no connection with India until Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498. But look at this carving. It clearly shows a giraffe on the left side, and all its legs, body, and long neck are shown with remarkable accuracy. Notice how even its face, the ears, and even its long tail are carved perfectly, depicting a real giraffe. This is incredible because giraffes are found only in Africa, and this temple was built no later than 1250 AD. And giraffes are not found in Egypt, where we know advanced civilization existed, but are found far down south in the African continent. According to historians, Vasco da Gama was the first person to ever visit India from Africa. They claim that he had briefly explored Africa before reaching India in 1498. How is an African giraffe accurately carved at least 250 years before Vasco da Gama's arrival to India?
This video is from 9 years ago, and it depicts the giraffe and Africans that come along with the giraffe portrayed in India. Now, you're probably going to ask, how do I know that they're African based on those drawings? Well, let's first let him explain the video. By the way, he's Indian, and then we will come back and talk about it. Remember, Africa and India were very interconnected in the past. Very.
Let's take a good look at the entire carving. It clearly shows an Indian king sitting on an elephant on the left side. You can even see another person sitting in front of him who controls the elephant. On the right side, you can see several people wearing long skirts standing on the ground. The clothing and faces are carved distinctly different from other Indian sculptures to show that they are African people. It also looks like they are lifting a few other people who are giving something to the Indian king. On the far right, you can see the giraffe, and there is also a young boy sitting on it. You can also see a bystander watching this entire scene. Did this meeting happen while an Indian king was traveling to Africa? It's less likely because the sculptor who carved this would not have seen it. It is much more likely that African travelers visited India way before Vasco da Gama, which is not mentioned anywhere in history. And whether this journey took place through land or water, it is truly a remarkable feat to bring a giraffe alive through such a long trip. So now we know that India was connected to Africa centuries before what the history claims. It also proves that ancient Africans had a very advanced civilization that was capable of making journeys to other continents. Thanks to the Indian sculptor for carving such an accurate scene, because without this, we would just be depending on mainstream historians.
The ancient connection between India and Africa goes back a little more than just centuries, even though he's fully accurate. Now, how far does this connection go? Well, before we do that, let's first talk about some more detailed accounts of Africans in India, not as conquerors, not as slaves, but just as people, two nations meeting up. For example, this painting, and this is from the BBC, this painting from 1590 shows an Indian prince eating in the land of the Ethiopians or the land of the Zanj. Whatever it is, we know that it was written down or depicted as Africa, East Africa. And of course, you can see the multiple cultures and how most of these women themselves are portrayed as Muslim. This is where it doesn't help because we all know that Zangis were Muslim and so were some Somali and Ethiopian Habshi people. Uh, what does help, though, is the fact that the people who are portrayed as Indians slightly brighten themselves in the presence of Indians, which is fairly accurate for most Indians in these centuries. The fact that they were a little lighter, but obviously there's some Indians who are just as dark as the other people. But in that, they usually make sure the hair is very, very different than the other people. But like this guy says about mainstream archaeology, there's this either or thing. Either they're Habshi, either they're Somali, either they're Zangi. But what we know about history is that there is periods of combination between these groups. Remember, I read at one point that some Portuguese historians, when they landed in Africa, they realized that all the Muslims were kind of brothers in a sense. And so in Mozambique, when he first got there, the Muslims that were there had direct communication with Turks. In other words, even though the message would take days to get there, they could send orders from Mozambique all the way to Turkey. And then the people from Turkey could respond or send orders themselves down. The fortress that we see here, and remember, this is in Africa. That part is proven that this is taking place in Africa. The fortress that is here is beautifully depicted. It shows a high level of skill. But not only that, there is no exception to it, meaning that even though this is in the 1500s, there is no other group depicted, not Arabs, not white people, not nobody, just black Africans being portrayed around one prince from India who is depicted as very light skinned. You can see him sitting over there. This is the true Africa. And of course, you can see the African uh, pots that the men are carrying on their head. And there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. This also depicts something that I think needs to be talked about, which is African cotton. But I'll cut back to that at the end of the video. So let's zoom into the image before we look at other images of Africans that are clearly depicted as Africans and have been proven to be Africans by several museums. But first, okay, so we zoom in and we look right here at the bottom. So these men, as you can see, are eager. They brought all they can to come for trade. And you can see the way they dressed is very unique and it's very different. Now, not all of these people are African. In fact, I think the people who are African here are the people seated on the ground. I think those are the Muslims. Now, let's zoom in to the top. I think this is the giveaway that we're talking about Africa. You're seeing it, but you're not seeing it. You're thinking, what is it that I'm not seeing? Well, let's observe it. Here's a clue using other tribes that traded with the Mughals. Yep, that's right. 90% of the time, the people who are being traded with are men. But in this case, it happens to be females sitting around talking with a prince in trade while the men are standing on the outside bringing in the wares. This is a wild separation between Africa and many other places of the world. And if you've ever read Vasco da Gama's book on India, in India, they didn't play the females can do whatever they want games. That was something that they were fully against. Now, there were some free people, but not typically. But because of the way Africa works, he found himself in a situation where you can see there he spices everything that he had to trade with these people. Now remember, there's a place called Aramata in Africa where a lot of spices were brought to Africa by the Indians and other Arabs who came with Indian spices. And this is where the trade really began, the modern trade. So this is a quote from Herodotus and how different Egypt was. Now remember, I've given you tons of evidence that shows that Egyptian women were very differently treated than any other continent except for Africa. But let's read it. I now proceed to give more particular account of Egypt. It possesses more wonders than any other country, and exhibits works greater than can be described in comparison with all other regions. Therefore, more must be said about it. The Egyptians, besides having a climate peculiar to themselves, and a river differing in its nature from all other rivers, have adopted the custom and usage in almost every respect different from the rest of mankind. Let's first pause there before I read the next part. Keep in mind, right now, he's not crafting a fake narrative. What he's doing is he's putting out there, like, disclaimer, or, yeah, disclaimer. Listen, I've told you about all the things that are weird about Egypt, but this is the weirdest thing that I saw with my own eyes. And he says, among them, the women attend the markets and traffic, but the men stay at home and weave. Other nations in weaving throw the wool upwards, the Egyptians downwards. So we pause there. So what we see there is him saying, or he says, that the among them the women attend the markets and traffic. So in other words, the men, even though they do a lot of the work, obviously, the women are the ones that are engaged in trade and markets, which is not weird, right? It's not weird in Africa. Remember, I showed you in Africa, women are, if something is not too burdensome, meaning it's not moving giant blocks, the job belongs to the females, and the markets is one of them. And that's what happened. You go look anywhere, go depict anywhere, find random places in Africa, and you will find that the markets were just filled with females. Now, I don't want to make it sound like they were just in charge of their husbands necessarily. That's not how it worked. Basically, they were working for their husbands by going to the market and stuff like that. In the head of the Africans, it was never thought that a woman doing something for you put her ahead of you. So, you go and tell her like, yo, go buy this, this, and that, and that, and that. And then she goes and does it. But also, she is responsible outside of your control for stuff like that. Now, having said that, I think it's important that I show this picture, which depicts another African in India. And if you've watched my channel, you probably know him. This is the African who was a prime minister to a female in India who, things went sideways in India because obviously they were not too happy about having a female as the main leader. And of course, there might have been some distrust or mistrust for a black African who was basically selected instead of the person who she was supposed to marry, who was, I think, related to her. I think that was the point. Like, there was another noble, but she married someone who was quote unquote of another class. This is the African. So this adds on to this thing of no, 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 no. Africans were in India, and I can show you tons of pictures of them everywhere. And not only that, they're written about. They're called Zangi in some and called Habshi in others. And of course, there's a lot of account of them from Ethiopia because they went from Ethiopia. And then, not to mention, of course, that there's depictions of other races in India, including white people. Remember, when white people eventually came, and this is why you know we can rely on the Indians, because when they eventually came, they depicted every race that they encountered. Chinese, Japanese, anybody that they encountered, they would visualize and put them down. And in this case, it was the black Africans. So, for those of you who don't know the story, a quick rundown. And you can see his beard, the way it's depicted. It's, it's got that um, African texture to it, which is beautifully done over here. And it tells you, and look how comfortable the guy behind him is. So this guy's name is Iglis Khan, and you can see here he's depicted doing some very important work, holding a sword. This woman who's in the corner is Chind Bibi, the Sultanate or Sultanate Bibi. She is this guy's lover, and they were together. She promoted him as by marrying him or by wanting to marry him. Obviously, the marriage was not approved of by the general population, but it tells you how far up the station a black person could get in history. Now, I want to show other visual pictures of Africans, and like I said, there's actually hundreds of them, but you have to like go and get the actual documents and the actual pictures in order to see them. And like I said, they depicted other people of other races, not just black people. So we can see that it was an open area a little bit to people from all over the world. Now, how far back the connection goes is actually a mystery, and it is thought that the African connection goes back as far as the Indus civilization. It's even thought that Egypt didn't have access to the Indus civilization. It was just Africa. It was just the East, the Horn of Africa had access to the Indus civilization, and the Sumerians obviously had access to the Indus civilization. And this sort of horn shape might have been the earliest version of trade between the two. Here depicted is another African who is a worker, and this is the guy who started the fortress, and this is another African man, and this is the same person. Now, keep in mind that the connection between them was not some connection between them being Muslim, because this connection goes back at least to the first century AD. We know that at least that far back there is a connection between these places. And this is prior to when the Arabs sort of formulated a nice, huge group. Now, I did promise to talk about cotton, but I think I should do it in a separate video because, of course, it's a very long discussion. Now, also, remember when I show you Africans being depicted by anyone everywhere, speaking of cotton, you must remember one thing. Africans, when seen trading, are almost never depicted dressed in, lion or let's say leather or anything like that. They're always seen dressed in these fabrics. This is because cotton was domesticated in Africa as early as it was anywhere else. But we'll look at that later.